Lando Norris may be McLaren's golden boy right now, but he has an exceptional young teammate who's almost on world championship form. And that's why I think Lando is likely to do the Danny dip and jump ship to another team as soon as 2026. No driver would be happy about team orders to hand the victory to a teammate they are 5 seconds ahead of. But I want to be clear about something. I don't think Norris is scared of Piastri. In fact, I might even be able to convince you that him leaving McLaren would be a good idea. So stick around to the end, and if I haven't convinced you by then, you can deconstruct all of my arguments in the comments. This is the Danny dip. Ever since Oscar joined McLaren, I've had this sneaking suspicion that he was going to usurp the team out from under Lando. I've bit my tongue on the subject for quite a while because speculating on a subject like this brings the haters out in droves. But now that there's trouble in paradise, I think it's time we seriously discuss why this is a real possibility. Formula One may be a team sport, but at the front of the grid, they follow the Sith rule of two. Two drivers, a master who has the power, and an apprentice to crave it and train under the master to one day fulfill their role. And as far as McLaren is concerned, we can actually trace the roots of their current situation all the way back to 2014. The first and most obvious example of the Danny dip is ironically Sebastian Vettel jumping ship from Red Bull to Ferrari in 2015. One could argue that Seb was lured to Ferrari by Red Bull's poor form and the prospect of being like Mike, but it was also pretty clear that his young teammate was outperforming him, and if Red Bull could get their shit together and challenge for another title, Ricciardo would be the driver the team lined up behind. Vettel wasn't done holding the power of being lead driver, and I think that played a huge role in his dip to Ferrari. And in 2014, Ricciardo was quite possibly the best driver on the grid. So Danny did to Vettel what Vettel did to Webber. Showed up and stole the team out from underneath him. Actually, now that I think about it, this is a usurpers all the way down type situation. But Mark Webber didn't jump ship to another team. He lost motivation and retired, so not quite the same. Following Vettel's exit, Red Bull got really enamored with drivers named Danny and put the Russian Daniil Kvyat alongside the Australian Daniel they already had. But Russian Danny rubbed people the wrong way. And even though he scored 3 more points than Aussie Danny did in 2015, he was about to be cast aside for the new hotness in town. A 17-year-old Dutchman that we now know as the GOAT. But back then, he was just an awkward kid with a really wide mouth and exceptional racing skills. So just 4 races into 2016, Russian Danny got dropped, and Aussie Danny found himself in the position of master once again. But this time, with an apprentice who was much younger than him. At least he thought he held the power of lead driver. But soon, it became apparent the student was becoming the master. Danny may have finished 52 points ahead of Max in 2016, but you need to remember that Verstappen had 4 fewer races in a Red Bull than Danny did, so it's not really a fair comparison. Then in 2017, Danny beat Max 200 to 168, but the writing was already on the wall. By 2018, after the incident where Max rear-ended Danny and Ricciardo wasn't satisfied with the team's response, that's when we got to see Danny dip from Red Bull to Renault, in exchange for a dump truck full of money. Netflix portrayed this as the honey badger running from a fight, but that's not how I saw it. And I don't think Lando will be running from a fight either if he leaves McLaren. You have to keep in mind when Danny left for Renault, Red Bull had just signed a deal for Honda power units, and this was just 1 year after the famously failed partnership between Honda and McLaren that had Alonso calling it a GP2 engine. At this point in his career, Danny had experienced all of his success with Renault power units. They were familiar, a known quantity, offering him stability and the guarantee of being lead driver. And of course, importantly, their offer came with enough money to buy a nice house in Vancouver. That's a lot of money. All of these factors come into play when a driver who's considered a top talent feels like their position within the team is threatened. But most importantly, it creates an opportunity for other top teams to snatch up a hot commodity. When Ferrari picked up Seb, he actually helped bring them back to the front until he lost his mojo in 2018. And when Renault picked up Danny, he got them back on the podium again. But you might find yourself thinking, weren't both those drivers snatched up from teams that weren't at the front? So why would Lando want to leave McLaren? Simple. if he got an offer from a team like Red Bull or Mercedes. Rumors have been abound all season that Max might migrate to a Merc. And we already know that Lewis is doing the Danny dip to Ferrari for enough money to get Oprah's attention. And both of these teams are fighting at the front right now, so it wouldn't exactly be a step down for Lando. Horner has explicitly expressed interest in Lando in the past, and if Norris doesn't feel like his team is 100% behind him, I can see him accepting an offer from Red Bull to go be their number one driver. And Red Bull is a team that very clearly endorses one man to be their lead driver, a luxury that can only be afforded by a team that's fighting at the front. F1 teams are usually amicable when they're trashed here. Even up in the midfield, the drivers have to work together to get whatever points they can for the team, sometimes sacrificing their own race to help their teammate get a position they wouldn't be able to get on their own. Case in point, Alonso's masterclass defense that helped Ocon get his maiden victory in Hungary 3 years ago. But now that McLaren is at the front fighting for victories, the gloves are off and Piastri has stepped up. This isn't like when Danny dipped to McLaren and couldn't keep up. Oscar's move to McLaren has been a match made in heaven. He's a young talent who's constantly improving and is now fighting at the front, just like young Lando did many moons ago. But now the shoe is on the other foot. And while Lando has been at the top of his game hasn't been good enough. Multiple times, he has lost a race in the fastest car. Too often, we hear Lando telling the press afterwards that he made too many mistakes, that he should have got the victory, but didn't. And you may find yourself thinking, now hold on just a minute, Oscar was in the same car and he did even worse in most of those races. And outside of Hungary, you'd be right, but there's one key difference. This is only Oscar's second year in the sport. He's already going toe-to-toe with the greatest drivers on the grid and proving himself worthy of being called their competitor. Lando may still look like a child, but he's on his 6th year of being in Formula One. He's in his prime. At this point in time, we know what to expect from the man. A very high level of performance with a few mistakes here and there. So, while he may be currently outperforming Piastri, Oscar is improving at an alarming rate and seems set to surpass him in the coming years. There is no arguing that Oscar is on an upward trajectory with no end in sight. Piastri is a consummate professional, and you don't hear the turmoil on the team radio between him and his race engineer that you do between Lando and his. Oscar shows up, does his job, does it well, and then goes to work the next day to go over his notes and do a better job next time. He's still benefiting from rookie gains. Since he's so new, it is much easier for him to improve than, say, someone who's been on the grid for many years. And that's why I can see McLaren wanting to make sure that he sticks around long term. If he has the capacity to outperform a driver as good as Lando, they want to make sure he's in a McLaren when he does it. So if the writing is on the wall, when do I think Lando would leave? Well, I can't see a world in which Lando leaves McLaren next year. Their car is just too good right now. But if the team dynamic is feeling iffy, the time to jump ship would be for the rules change in 2026. It's no guarantee they'll nail the new regulations. In fact, McLaren actually has a pretty poor record for nailing the new regs right away. Not to mention, Lando's stock has never been higher. He's finally got some wins under his belt, both literally and metaphorically. And if he wanted to literally cash in on his current performance, I'm sure there are tons of teams that would be willing to offer him dump trucks of money the way Renault did for Danny. But I personally don't think he would be too swayed by cash. Don't forget, he bought his way into the sport with daddy's money. If he wants tens or hundreds of millions of dollars, all he has to do is wait for his inheritance. No, what I think will sway Lando will be a team that has a history of hitting the ground running in a new rule set, along with the guarantee of being lead driver and enough money to flatter his ego. And the team that I can see doing that would be Red Bull if Max leaves, or Mercedes if he doesn't. Given how openly antagonistic Max has been with his team as of late, not to mention Mercedes' recent improvement in form, I wouldn't be surprised if Verstappen rage quit and went to Mercedes. And on that subject, the Canadian Positivity Guy is here to offer his opinion. World champion Max Verstappen has put on a masterclass of bitching on the radio. I haven't heard someone chirp their own team this hard since the last time I went to a Leafs game. But credit to Lambiase, he didn't take Max's beaking like a little bitch. He gave it right back. This is in stark contrast to McLaren, who went from asking Norris to let Piastri pass, to telling him, to begging him. Frankly, it was kinda sad. GP has a spine, and when his driver is being a whiny little prick, he reaches through the radio and slaps some sense back into him. On the other hand, McLaren's 10-ply race engineers have no idea how to handle a diva backdooring his own teammate. McLaren dropped the ball when they undercut their own driver to cover Hamilton, which was almost as dumb as Ricciardo pitting on lap 7 to cover Hamilton. These were both so stupid that I'm putting "to cover Hamilton" on my roster of nonsense phrases that I use when I need to justify doing something stupid, right next to "this will ruin the tour." McLaren should not have been surprised when Lando big-timed them over the radio. Lando acted like a teenager who was trying to assert himself, but then he ended up backing down at the last moment, which might even be worse. If he really wanted to win, he could have handed the position back right away and then raced Oscar really hard right to the end. Honestly, it wouldn't have made that much difference if he had just held on to the lead and taken the victory. He'd already put everyone through all the turmoil, but at least he would have been able to close the gap to Verstappen in the Drivers' Championship, which in my opinion is a more defensible position. But this isn't just Lando's fault. It's all of McLaren. Oscar for not catching up, and the team for the schmelt tier strategy. This is the kind of shit that causes your star player to consider a transfer. So I have just one piece of advice for McLaren. Give your balls a tug, tit. And now, for the poll of the week. I asked, which McLaren driver will score more points in 2025? 21% said Oscar Piastri, and 79% said Lando Norris. This just goes to show that public sentiment is still very firmly in Lando's corner. And rightly so. He still leads his teammate by a fair margin and continues to catch Max. There was some speculation that Max was off his form because he stayed up late sim racing, but it doesn't matter. He could take the next 3 races off and Lando could win all 3 and Max would still be 1 point ahead. And that, right there, is the #1 reason McLaren should have let Lando take the win. If they want any chance of one of their drivers taking the WDC this season, they need to throw all of their weight behind Norris. The only reason not to do that is because you're trying to keep Oscar happy long term. But in doing so, they may be giving Lando license to start sniffing around for other teams that will be willing to make the hard decision and endorse a single driver for the win. And let's be real, Lando is the only driver with a realistic chance of catching Max this season. And if you're interested in how that might affect their friendship, why don't you watch this video next, where I talk about why they can't be friends anymore.